Earlier, I spoke to the travel writer Fionn Davenport, and I began by asking him how important Airbnb is for Ireland's tourism sector.
It's hugely significant, particularly in big urban places like Dublin, where it has been a dominant player in the market. I mean, it's the sole biggest provider of bed nights in the state for a number of years. And so for that reason alone, I think Amanda Couples's comments today are quite significant and, dare I say, long overdue.
Is Airbnb seen as being a cheaper alternative now to hotels in Ireland?
I mean, yes, I suppose that many people see it as, because there's greater options, so you can rent literally, you know, the box room if you want, or you could rent a whole apartment. So really, it's not so much as that it's the cheaper option, but it's the one with the greatest amount of variety. And so as a result, you get a far bigger choice in price bracket. However, as it works out, because Airbnb generally operates on a dynamic pricing model, it doesn't work out to be that much cheaper than a hotel. And particularly in recent years now, up to COVID, there was a lot of mid-range and budget hotels opening up in Dublin, which were taking a slice of the Airbnb market.
Why do owners of properties choose to use Airbnb over the more traditional rental routes?
Well, I guess it's easier. There's a greater chance for profits, and so you're not locked into rental agreements. Short-term letting is managed properly, is a hugely profitable enterprise, and until a number of years ago went largely unregulated. And so landlords were able to say you could rent a property or a room for cheap enough in February, but come the summertime, you could rent it for an astronomical fortune. And so for that reason alone is that it became a much more attractive option for landlords than long-term rental rather.
Lonely Planet today, they issued a warning to tourists thinking about coming to visit Dublin. What exactly did they have to say? It wasn't great, was it?
Well, no. I mean, it was a list of 8 things you really need to prepare yourself for a visit to Dublin. And the media picked up on 2 of them, which is one is that hotel prices are exorbitant. Now, we know this, and we've been talking about it in Ireland for a number of weeks. It's frighteningly high. We have TDs sleeping in cars because they can't get a hotel. We have basic rooms going for multiples of what any reasonable person would expect them to go for. So that's a huge problem coming into the summer as tourism returns to Dublin after the 2.5 years of COVID. The second issue was car rental. And that obviously is a national problem. And it's an international problem, but it's hitting us quite a lot here. We had some very high profile cases on radio and in the media in recent weeks of American visitors who were being charged $10,000 to rent a car for a week. Now, that is an exaggeration in as much as that's not the kind of high prices. However, it's for a regular small car to get it for 700, 800, 900 euro a week is not uncommon. And that's incredibly expensive for car rental in this country. So they're the 2 broad things. So basically is, look, Dublin is a very expensive city to come at the best of times. It's much more expensive, and you're going to struggle to find a hotel room in summer, which is not really great advertisement of the city for international tourists.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you for your contribution, as always, Fionn.
Thanks.
So, Paul, that's a pretty eminent travel guide. Many people will be familiar with it. Many people will refer to it. Ireland has spent a number of years, I think, trying to build up its reputation as a good place for tourists to visit. We have, I think, worked hard to be seen to be more competitive than maybe we were in the past. But you'd have to admit that reputation is now under threat.
And that's why it's so important that whatever steps we take around Airbnb, that we're not reducing the supply of accommodation that might be, for example, informal B&B type accommodation. But actually what we're doing is we're tackling accommodation that's being used as a kind of more informal or unregulated version of long-term rental. That's what we need to target if we're going to deal with Airbnb.
But the reality is, Paul, is that if you bring in these regulations, the whole idea, I presume, is to sure that not so many properties are available on Airbnb, which means there's going to be more demand for hotel prices and those prices are going to go up, surely?
Of course, and look, you only have to look to some of the protests in Dublin City over the last few years around the call for us having communities rather than locations where hotels gather. And that's our community saying we don't want our cities to be places only for tourists.
I'm just wondering, how do you do both?
Well, that's the job of government. The job of government is to balance the both. But I'm saying to you here that what we want to do is take out those people who are using Airbnb for long-term rental. That has to be the impact of the intervention.
You have to prioritise here. There's a housing crisis. A crisis normally happens for a short period of time, and we've had it going on for decades at the moment. The government must focus first and foremost on housing. And it's actually pushing up the cost of houses at the moment, because the more rents that can be achieved on a monthly basis from these homes actually shoots up the investment value of the property.
Adrian, most of the Airbnbs available are outside of Dublin, isn't that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I put many of these points to Airbnb because that is the discussion we're having in this country about it. Now, they came back to me with some figures and they said, well, number one, the vast majority of Airbnb stays are actually outside Dublin. So mostly it's in rural areas or holiday spots. They also claim that 2 out of 3 Airbnb stays are actually Irish people moving from one part of the country to another to go on holidays or for a weekend. And that's not to fully explain the housing crisis, but it is worth noting that it's not primarily a Dublin or a Cork or a Limerick thing, despite the figures, fairly damning figures that we have.
And they did also say, Paul, that Airbnb are not responsible for the housing shortage or the housing crisis in this country. And yet they're being asked to be part of the solution, or the homeowners who use Airbnb are being asked to be part of the solution.
But you can't have the President of the country calling the housing situation a disaster and then not look at every corner of society to try and see how we can solve it. And as I say, the issue of vacant homes, the issue of Fair Deal and the issue of Airbnb, they're all small supply streams, but collectively, along with the public housing building programme, they will help address the problem.
But the fact is, you're saying that it's a very small, each one of these measures brings in a small supply. We actually don't really know.
That's true.
Like the full figures. We don't still have the vacancy numbers about how many properties. The Pascal Donoghue hasn't released that from the property register or the property tax. We still don't know that. The Airbnb, we still don't really have a proper grasp on how many of those properties. So to say that actually just that some of these things are just small measures, when you actually add them all up, they could have a huge impact on the housing crisis.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what do you say, Paul and Peadar, in the middle of a cost of living crisis, when people are really struggling and perhaps trying to take in other income streams and are using something like Airbnb? What do you say to those people this evening?
And to repeat the point I made earlier, if somebody's letting out a room in their home and it's effectively an informal B&B, that's what the platform is designed for, and I don't think anybody has an issue with that. And that will never convert into a long-term home. Perhaps maybe for student accommodation, but it's unlikely to. What we want to do is tackle those people who are using it for long-term rentals and are effectively doing it. Look, we've 2 sets of people here. One that are subject to a rent pressure zone and limiting the amount of rent they can increase. And we've got other landlords using Airbnb for longer term rentals that don't have that same regulation. That's not fair. And we have to bring a degree of fairness to that.
Should it apply to people who have holiday homes?
Well, look, I think it's okay for people to have other properties, and we saw with the vacant home tax that I hope we will see in this budget once Pascal releases the figures. There's a subtlety in all of this. One person's holiday home is another person's home that they use for sometimes for work and sometimes not.
Okay,
so we have to build in those sort of subtleties into any new scheme.
Just very quickly, I want to get in Adrian, because I know, Adrian, you're not with us for part 2. Other cities have had to tackle this Airbnb issue head on. What have they done and what's been successful?
Well, in a number of other countries, France and the Netherlands, Portugal, 1 or 2 others, they have done something similar to this idea of a national register. There's a lot of outrage in France. There's a lot of heat in France in particular, because that was at the vanguard in the early days of homes being used for Airbnb, and it led to quite a significant housing crisis. The local councils there took action. So what you have seen is a type of national register being set up, typically city by city, town by town, and Airbnb has complied with those administrative measures.
And did it mean that some of those properties came back onto the traditional rental market?
Ultimately it did. Ultimately it meant that they couldn't go on to Airbnb, so they had to go through the proper routes to change their property if they wanted to rent it out for longer, yeah.